Welcome to all of you. Nice to see you. I'm Louise Cort. I'm the curator for ceramics at the Freer and Sackler, which means I take care of Japan, China, Korea, and Southeast Asia. So I've been working with this collection. Although I don't speak Korean, I haven't done a lot of research in Korea, so I feel I'm its caretaker, not its in-depth researcher. But we have a wonderful collection of Korean ceramics, and that's really the strength of our collection. And it's out in this gallery. How many of you have worked with clay, taken courses in clay? Oh, that's amazing. So how many can tell me what clay is? What is clay? Clay is not dirt. That's the most important first thing to learn. If you take dirt from your garden and you shape it into something and you put it in a kiln and fire it, it'll come out as a pile of dirt.
Well, where I'm from in New York, it's literally clay.
If you take clay from your garden, okay, and shape it up into something and put it in a kiln, it will take a shape that will, depending on how high you fire it and the nature of the clay, it will not revert to a powdery substance for thousands and thousands of years. That's why ceramics are so important to archaeologists. You can dig up 4,000, 5,000-year-old fired clay, and it's still taking its shape. Just to review quickly, because everything in this gallery, with the exception of the stone casket and the wooden box and some other things, are made of clay. Clay is basically rock. It's rock that has weathered from being exposed over many, many thousands of years to rain, to wind, to sun, to freezing temperatures, and it gradually crumbles, and you're looking like you're trying to imagine this process. Crumbles into a fine, fine substance that is mainly alumina and silica. The most important thing about it is that in the soils of DC, which is also clay, and New York and other places, this clay is made up of platelets that slide back and forth over one another when there's water in between them. And that's what makes it possible for you to take a ball of clay and work it and shape it. And then, as you know, if you've worked with clay, once the water begins to evaporate and the clay dries out, it can no longer move. But it's the capacity of the platelets in the clay to move around that makes it possible to make all of these shapes. So you can imagine every single piece in this case as beginning as just a ball of clay. The other part, and then the clay is fired to make it permanent. And depending on the kind of clay you may have dug up and used, there's a kind of clay called stoneware, which represents all of the pieces in this gallery. Stoneware is a fairly pure clay, so it's mostly that weathered alumina and silica mixture. And so you have to fire it up to around 1250 degrees centigrade in an enclosed space called a kiln in order to have it do what we call vitrify, which is turn into almost a glass-like substance. All of the components of the clay melt, basically, and become glass, and that's why stoneware is so strong and durable, and it's not porous, so water, liquid will not seep through it. So that's why stoneware has always been used for a long time for containers for wine or containers for pickles or other sorts of containers with liquid.
You said the elements that they are essentially are alumina and silica?
Yeah.
Is alumina aluminum or is it something else?
Aluminum comes from alumina, but don't ask me the exact connection. So you fire stoneware clay up to a high temperature, it becomes hard, rock-like, again, goes back to its original form, and is non-porous. There's another basic kind of clay called earthenware, which is the same materials that have weathered out of the rock, but have been washed typically downhill, and they accumulate along riverbanks or in depressions in the flat ground. And along the way, they pick up typically a lot of other materials that combine to color them, usually a darker color, red or brown, and then also reduce the temperature at which they will become irreversible when they're fired. So earthenware fires to about 800 or 900 degrees. Think of all of the flower pots, the clay flower pots in your backyard. That's earthenware. And one important aspect of earthenware is that it is porous. So the extra water in the flower pot can seep out. If you have an earthenware cooking pot, you can put it directly on a fire and it won't shatter. If you have an earthenware pot for storing drinking water, the water will seep out through the body and evaporate and cool the water that's inside. We don't have any earthenware in this gallery, but I wanted to mention it just to give it fair play.
Is earthenware the same as terracotta?
Yes, basically it's what is often called terracotta. Terracotta is kind of an elegant way to talk about earthenware, especially when it's used for sculpture. So, stoneware is the body of all of the pieces you see around in this gallery. The other ingredient is glaze. And glaze is basically the same materials as made up the clay, usually mixed with some ash to lower the firing temperature a little bit so that before the clay melts completely and collapses, the glaze on top of it will melt and form, again, something like glass. So when we're looking at any of the ceramics in here that we're going to be talking about, we're talking about stoneware clay supporting a covering of glass-like glaze. Does that all make some kind of sense? Okay. Yeah.
You're saying that so the clay before it melts, the glaze melts to kind of cover it. Is that the process?
Yes. Yes. It melts at a lower temperature so that you don't have to fire up the kiln so high.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
I think that when I have fired clay pieces and glazed them, it's been two separate firings. Is that not always necessary?
Certainly in Korea at this time, it probably was not done that way. It can be done in two steps.
Yeah.
You basically fire the unglazed piece until to a low temperature just to make it hard. And then you add the glaze and fire it again up to the high temperature. That's a modern and somewhat extravagant way of firing ceramics. And most of the potters who worked up until the 20th century, the 19th century maybe, would try to do everything in one firing to use as little firewood as possible. But you're right, now it can be done that way. But the technology for making these ceramics in Korea during the Koryo period came from China. And the Chinese potters were the ones who developed the kind of kiln that would fire these ceramics successfully, especially when they were covered with the kind of glaze that was the dominant glaze in the Koryo period called celadon. I'll talk about celadon in a minute in the next door gallery, but this greenish glaze, or glaze of many different shades of green, was the prominent glaze favored by the potters in the Koryo period, in part because it was such an important glaze in China. And the technology arrived in Korea together with the aesthetics of this green glaze. And that's how Koryo ceramics began in the 10th century or so. But let me go with you next door to the Chinese gallery so you can see the prototypes for the wares that we'll look at then closely here. This is a gallery of Chinese ceramics now of the Sung dynasty from the 12th and 13th century, so parallel to the Koryo dynasty. And there are 3 examples of what we call celadon ware in this gallery. If you look at them, there's one here, there's one there, and there's one in the case near the door. You'll see that they're all vaguely blue or green, but they're quite different in color from one another. Celadon is a convenient term to cover all of these different glaze colors. It's a French term. It comes from a French drama and refers to the color of the costume that was worn by a character named Celadon. And my colleague Jen Stewart, who's the curator for Chinese art, and I debated for a long, long time about whether we would continue to use this odd Western term to talk about Asian ceramics or not. The problem is that in China and Korea and Japan, where Chinese characters are the basis for the writing system, probably in Vietnam as well, there's one character, Chong in Korean, I may not be pronouncing it correctly, Ching in Chinese, Sei in Japanese, that means blue and green. And so the whole range of colors represented by these pieces can be embodied in that single term, single character, single concept, but it's extremely difficult to explain that briefly on a label in a gallery. So we finally decided it's simpler just to use the word celadon and then be done with it that way. But this little pot is very important in the story of Koryo ceramics because it comes from a kiln in southeastern China on the coast. You see here's the Korean peninsula right up here. Not a long trip from one place to the other. And it was a small kingdom called Wu Yue, and the pottery is called Yue ware. And the kingdom basically collapsed in the 10th century, and the potters who were making this wonderful celadon glazed stoneware were out of work. And in some way that we don't understand, some of them were recruited or volunteered and went to Korea and introduced to Korea the complex technology of processing the clay to make stoneware, very fine grained stoneware, and then producing the glaze to apply over it, and the decorative techniques as well. This is a good example of technological transfer and a very important moment in the history of ceramics in Korea. And I want you to come, if you can, come even closer just to take a look at the way this box is decorated. It was made rather thickly, and then the decoration is carved by hand into the clay while it's still soft. A wonderful use of relief carving with keeping in mind that when the glaze melted over this, in the areas that are most deeply carved, the glaze would accumulate. And since the glaze is basically like a transparent glass, when we look at those thicker areas, we're seeing more color in it. Whereas the thinner areas on the thinner glaze on the higher areas is a paler color. The color of celadon comes from one particular metallic oxide. Have you come across that in your reading? Anybody want to guess? Iron, right, exactly. And this particular color of green is the result of firing glaze that has iron in it with very little oxygen, which means basically the potters are stuffing lots of fuel into the kiln, more fuel than can really burn readily. The fuel is clamoring for oxygen to help it burn. It literally sucks the oxygen right off the iron oxide molecules in the glaze and does what we call reducing them to a form called FeO, which, when fired, produces this green color. If you take an oxygen glaze and you fire it with an iron glaze and fire it with lots of oxygen, you get the kind of chocolate brown that is also there. So an amazing, versatile pigment that can do all kinds of things. It's very important to potters for that reason. So Yue ware is this color green. Then I want you to take a look at this little cup stand. It was made to put a bowl in it to rest on the circular framework for a bowl for wine or a bowl for tea. This is a very rare, short-lived kind of ware that was produced in China only in the early 12th century in northern China. It's called ruware, and it was made for the imperial court under very tightly controlled circumstances. And you can see that the glaze is quite a different color from the Yue ware. This is about a century later and from northern China rather than southern China. So different materials are helping to affect the color of the glaze. But this pale sort of robin's egg blue color over the gray clay, and almost no decoration except for those raised ridges that suggest flower petals. So a very different aesthetic. We'll show you, I'll show you cordio ceramics that echo the aesthetics of Yue ware, but then we also have a few pieces made in the early 12th century that echo the aesthetics of this ruware. And it was that group of ceramics made in Korea that somehow got back to China. And the Chinese connoisseurs, who were very reluctant to praise anything except what's made in China, even had to admit that that Korean Celadon ceramic was exceptionally beautiful. So it's a high moment in the history of Korean Celadon. And then the third piece I want to show you is yet a different color and a different appearance. This is from the kiln called Lungchuan, the blue bowl. And it has a much thicker Celadon glaze on it. The clay body underneath the glaze is whiter, so the overall effect is of this white quality of the glaze. This is the kind of glaze that was sometimes compared to jade. So it's yet another effort to make Celadon, but all within this family of Celadon. So here's the background in China, and now I want to go and look at what the Koreans did with this, because they borrowed many techniques, as you're going to see, of course, for building kilns and the kinds of things we can't see, literally, but they borrowed techniques, they borrowed ideas about shape, they borrowed ideas about decoration, but then they took off and added their own special something to those. So do you see any resemblance to
the relief carving?
Yeah,
Top.
indeed. This is a later piece, but it carries on that wonderful relief carving. The glaze, if anything, is closer to the Lungchuan, almost turquoise blue, swimming pool blue. But the team of potters who made this bottle, wine bottle, covered it with this carved decoration, careful to leave some deep areas outlining the design motifs. There are two birds, and then what is called a peony vine scroll. And one of your colleagues yesterday said, but peonies don't grow on vines. But this, she was right, but this motif called a vine scroll, this scrolling vine with leaves that can cover everything because it has no boundaries, is a technique for decoration that developed in China and then was borrowed along with other aspects of decoration in Korea and Japan. And if you look closely, you'll see peony flowers nestled in the vine, but otherwise it's a totally fantastic fantasy vine used to decorate the bottle overall. If you also look carefully, you'll see that there are little fine line incised accents in the leaves and in the bird. So it's a very time-consuming way of creating this wonderfully textured and decorated surface. This would have been the pride and joy of someone who was going to serve wine to his guests. And I should mention, that reminds me to mention now, that almost all of the ceramics in this gallery were preserved from the Koryo dynasty up until roughly the late 19th century because they were buried in tombs. The custom of wealthy families, was to build a stone-lined tomb that was like an underground room and equip it with objects that had been part of the specially treasured belongings of the deceased person. And those tombs remained largely untouched for many, many centuries. Fortunately and unfortunately, in the late 19th century, the political unrest in Korea opened the way for people who decided to become tomb robbers and dig into those tombs, see what they could find to sell and put on the market. And that was really the way collectors, both Korean and Westerners who were living in Seoul in the 1880s, 1890s, first became aware of Koryo ceramics as this beautiful class of Korean ceramic art that really no one had known about, or very few people, certainly outside of Korea, had known about until that time. Yeah.
So the pieces were not specially made for the funeral?
No, they were made for household use, domestic use, or ritual use, good question, but then they were put into the tomb. There are earlier pieces in the history of ceramics in Korea, you're probably thinking of them, that were made, we think, especially for burial, unglazed gray pieces. These, fortunately, got to be used. But let me take you now to a piece that looks like roofware in this collection.
Would that container we just saw actually be used for wine? Because it doesn't
Yeah.
look like a very good shape to pour from.
Well, the way the rim is made, it's very sharp, and so it would cut off the flow of wine.
So
You'd
it
have
would
to
dribble down.
You'd have to hold on to it. It's kind of big.
Right.
And we were talking yesterday about another common shape for serving wine, which is this gourd shape. You'll see it in several places, over there, in the middle of the room,
Looks a little more
back there.
user-friendly.
And yes, aside from being a wonderful natural shape, it's easy to grip right in the middle and make sure that nothing gets lost. These are all Koryo period ceramics. And I think it's really interesting to look at them and think about how at different moments, at different kilns, different degrees of experience in the potters, different colors came out, quite strikingly different. The earliest piece in this case is this ewer, an 11th century piece with this strikingly olive green color, representing a moment when the potters in Korea were still struggling to get the color they presumably wanted to get. The gourd-shaped ewer is a little bit later, but also still a beautiful glaze, but closer to the Yue glaze than to the blue-green roux-ware. The bowl that in this group is closest to roux-ware is this little one. And when we go into storage, you'll see that this has a very distinctive trait, or bowls like it have a distinctive trait. This bowl was glazed completely. In a quicker way of making pottery, you just leave the bottom of the bowl unglazed, and therefore you don't have to worry about glaze running down. But the people who were using bowls like this on their table wanted really, really nice bowls that were completely glazed. So then that created the problem of how to keep the glaze from sticking to whatever the bowl was resting on when the glaze was melting and the bowl was being fired. The roux potters in China had used a technique that the Koryo potters at the very highest level Koryo kilns adopted, which was to use 3 little pieces of white silica rock and make a little tripod support underneath. So when we look at ceramics in storage, you'll see some of the pieces that have those little tripod rest. The nice thing about them is the silica little stones get embedded in the glaze and there's no way to get them out. But they look very nice, and they're nice white crystalline stones. Cheaper pottery made at less ambitious kilns during the Koryo period would use balls of clay with sand in it. And that worked to keep the pots up and not stuck, but it wasn't as attractive when it was finished. So that's one of the hidden traits of this roux-like bowl. This group of pots is together in this case, I should mention, because they were collected by an American medical doctor, a medical missionary, who later took on a diplomatic role, who lived in Seoul in the 1880s, 1890s, and was one of those people who was going around the market looking to see what had come in from the latest delivery from the tomb robbers, and building a collection that he put up for sale when he came back to the United States, and which it was bought by Charles Freer in 1907, and that really became the beginning point of Freer's serious collecting of Korean ceramics. So our collection rests on this sort of awkward story of how tombs had to be robbed in order for Koryo Celadon to be discovered. But it happens with lots of different art forms, unfortunately. Another piece I'd like to just point out to you is this little bowl, which uses a different kind of decoration technique. It looks very much like the carved pieces, but it makes use of a dome-shaped, sort of mushroom-shaped clay mold that has a design carved into it. And the team of potters is working away. One person has the mold. Somebody else is throwing bowl shapes on the wheel. And then that freshly thrown bowl shape is turned upside down over the mold, pressed down, and the clay receives the imprint of the design. So it's a somewhat quicker way of decorating. You don't have to do each one
Mass production.
hand by hand. Right, mass production. So that style of decoration also comes into play. And then another kind of bowl that comes out of a Chinese prototype but is very, very common in Korea during the Koryo period is this so-called lotus bowl, which is decorated only on the outside by these layers of petals so that the whole bowl becomes a metaphor for a flower. And that happens quite often in Korean ceramics. These gourd-shaped wine bottles become gourds, and somebody yesterday pointed out that in Korea, a certain kind of gourd, even today, is commonly picked and dried, and when the seeds are emptied out, it can be used as a water container or a wine container, presumably. So the very old tradition of using a real gourd for carrying liquids is echoed in this very elegant version. I wanted, first of all, to show you something that I think pertains directly to what you'll be doing at District Clay. I'm not entirely sure, but I hope so. I mentioned to you that the potters during the Koryo dynasty took in the Chinese technology, took in the techniques for making a beautiful celadon glaze. But in particular, they added to that repertory this kind of ware, which is called inlaid celadon, or sangam in Korean. And this type of inlay is thought to have begun around the middle of the 12th century. And so far as we know, there are almost no Chinese prototypes for this. It really was, by and large, an invention of the Koryo potters who were looking for new and different ways to decorate their shapes. This is a stand for a little wine cup. A little hemispherical cup with the same kind of decoration would have stood on this. Unfortunately, we don't have it. Why don't you come closer, because I really want you to look down at this decoration. This is made by a process of first shaping the clay, and then, while the clay is still damp, carving out with little pointed wooden tools, probably, all of the decorations that you see around the piece reading as white flowers with black leaves. All of those shapes are cut out of the clay, and then using some kind of fine brush, probably, the decorator took liquid clay, white clay and black clay, mixed with enough water that it has kind of the texture of sour cream or something like that, daubing it into those recessed spaces, filling them up. Then when that added clay dries, the surface was scraped very carefully so anything that spilled out over the edge of the carved incised decoration would be taken off. What you end up with is this very, very sharp, interestingly sharp, precise, almost metallic kind of decoration. In the early Koryo wares, it's all done by hand. Later on, it starts to make more use of stamps and other ways of being quicker about getting it done. But these early pieces in particular are quite amazing. They bear a resemblance to a couple of other inlaid materials developed in Koryo. One is black lacquer inlaid with cutout shapes of mother of pearl. You can see how that echoes that. Another is something I wish I had an example of to show you, but we don't in our collection. Bronze vessels inlaid with silver. Those are extraordinarily beautiful with the dark copper green ground and the white outlines. So very close in effect to this white and black inlay under the celadon glaze. So this kind of decoration went right on being used throughout the rest of the Koryo period, continued in the Chosun period using just white clay, no longer black, and it made its way to Japan. This was an important technological and aesthetic transfer from Korea to Japan in the 15th and 16th century. This idea of inlaying designs into the tea bowls and vessels of other sorts that continues to the present day. I know potters today in Japan who still make Koryo-style inlaid ceramics or use the inlay technique.
What color is the clay body itself?
The clay body is a kind of gray, And that's a great question, because if you look closely at this piece, where the glaze is really, really thin, you see a kind of gray tonality under the glaze. Whereas where the glaze is thick, it's really strong blue and you can't see any suggestion of clay. The color we see looking at a ceramic is the color of the clay body underneath the translucent or transparent glaze. Unless the glaze is really thick and we can't see the body. But most of the time, what we're seeing is a mix of those, colors of those two materials that we translate into a color on its own. So if this were a dark brown clay body under this, the glaze would look different. It would be darker, murkier, and the whole effect would be quite different. So this pale gray, very nice clay body is an important part of this kind of technique.
So the inlaid clay is a different composition? What's it?
Slightly different, according to the research of Pam van de Veer, who worked on that. Different so that it wouldn't crack and fall out of the areas where it was inlaid before it was fired.
What about the
Color.
pinkish color? The pinkish color.
Pinkish color.
Like maybe the thin part?
That's just the clay body.
That's,
Gray?
I see what, I agree, it has a kind of pinkish tone to it. But that's the color of the clay, where the glaze is very, very thin on top of it. And the color of the inlaid, the clay for the inlay was white or black. White, probably a naturally occurring white clay, could have been porcelain, but black, probably mixed with iron and manganese and other things to turn a dark clay really black. So let's go back to the
Masterpiece.
star in the middle, because this is a really curious piece, totally Koryo, no precedent in China, and also representing the mid 13th century, so a full century and a half after most of the pieces in that case, or a full century after the inlaid cup stand. So after all, we're talking about several centuries in which tastes changed, materials changed, ideas of shape changed. But this is a truly sort of Baroque-looking wine ewer compared to the very simple gourd-shaped ewer there. First of all, you can see how heavily it's decorated. Even though it's in the shape of a gourd, those are lotus petals going up the side. That's always been a bit of a disconnect for me. I'm not sure what the potters were aiming at here. But this very careful intent to represent tiers of lotus petals. And again, you'll see very fine designs carved into the petal surface, so there's no area really that's left untextured. Then this scrolling handle and the spout that you'll see is made in the shape of a leaf. So echoing further this kind of vegetal metaphor. And then above all, in this little balcony that's made around the neck of the bottle, this amazing scene of little boys sitting in a lotus pond holding lotus buds in their hand. Then the extra things like the frog on the handle. You can just imagine that a team of potters spent a long, long time working out this group of pieces. And as, where are you? You reminded us that there are very few of these in existence. I think there's so few in existence that I think they must have been made all at one time by one group of potters who said, okay, we're really going to go for this. We're going to give it everything we have. We have a special order from the royal court. They want really wonderful wine bottles for some occasion. Here they are. And you can imagine how many of them would have not succeeded in order to have this very complicated shape come out perfectly, not just shaped, but perfectly fired in the kiln. The really outstanding feature of this piece is the use of copper. That is what gives us this amazing red pattern over the whole piece. And if you look closely at the copper, you'll see that there are little areas where the copper has turned green. Copper is really tricky to fire to get this red color. It has to be fired with very little oxygen, just as celadon glaze does. But it's much less forgiving than iron as a pigment. So if you get the least little bit of extra oxygen in there, it will start to turn green or gray. So these potters were very lucky in the way this ewer turned out. We know a lot about this small family of ewers because another one just like it was excavated from a tomb of a royal prince on Kanghwa Island, where the Koryo royalty was buried. Many of their tombs are there. And the tomb is dated to the mid-13th century, which gives us a latest possible date for this ewer. If we imagine that, as we were saying before, pieces like this would have been buried in the tomb of the deceased person, then maybe the prince had been lucky enough to use this for a while on his table before it was buried in his tomb. But the latest date is mid-13th century. It also has, and I think this really makes a big difference in the way we see the colors, these little accents of white, but they're not inlaid like the cup stand. They're daubed on with brush or some pointed tool. It just gives a little bit of lightness and brightness to the whole composition. But it's overall quite an amazing piece.
It's like a frosting.
Like a
Little frosting on the
yeah,
top.
exactly.
Brings it out.
So,
As if it needed more decoration. but
right.
It works.
Oh, one other thing, it did have something that we don't have to show you, and that is a lid. And the lid would have been shaped like a little cone that would have completed the line of the bud shape of the upper part of the body. And the lid would have had a little loop so that the frog, who was sitting there on the handle with a reason, could have held either a cord or a metal chain in his mouth that would connect to the loop on the lid so that they would stay together when the dishes were washed. It's common. You can see it on the gourd-shaped ewer at the end of the gallery, which does have a lid. Yeah.
I have a question.
So-
The second ewer that you were saying that was found in the prince's tomb, was that a recent find? Is that something that was recent? Do you know?
I don't know the exact date when it was found, I'm sorry, but
That's okay.
it is now a national treasure of Korea. It belongs to a private museum in Seoul, and so it's often published.
We rarely see the lids, though. I don't know if I've seen any.
Very few lids, very few matching lids came. It's funny that a lot of the ewers in the collection that was formed by Horace Allen came with lids, but they're usually mismatched lids. And so at some point when these pieces were moving through the market, somebody decided they should have a lid, and they took anything that fit and put it in place. But I've patiently been removing them and making a note, this doesn't belong to this piece originally, etc. But there is a feeling that the lid makes it complete.